We start another week. It's December 7th, I think. Monday. I'm a little bit early. It's 9:15, 16. And there's a reason for that. So if you know me, you've been watching what's been going on. We had we had two trees 2 weeks ago right in front of the house that were removed. They were hollowing. They were at least 100 years old. The house is 164 years old. Um, or sorry, 154 years old. Um, but what we found is I like to sit on the porch, and now there's no shade. So during the winter, that's okay. It was sunny and it was kind of warm yesterday on the porch. Uh, Actually, almost sweat-inducing. However, at 10 o'clock this morning, two new trees, blazing maple trees, 15-foot tall apiece, are being delivered and installed. So I have to be out there at least by 10. So I thought we'd do this 15 minutes earlier. And so some of you are used to 9:30, so if you join at 9:30, I get that. What I'm going to do is start a series on the Women's Health Initiative report of 2001. A friend of mine was at a bioidentical hormone conference this weekend and was posting quite a bit about some of the issues being discussed in this medical conference. Sorry, many of which I've talked about, actually going back to about 1990 when I started teaching medical students at the University of Nebraska Medical Center. And specifically, I was in the division of endocrinology, reproductive endocrinology and fertility. So I gave the lectures on hormone replacement therapy and estrogen, progesterone, et cetera, et cetera. And some of the controversies that have been around estrogen for a number of years. So even as a health coach, and I'm practicing physician anymore, I have clients that are taking hormone replacement. Virtually all of them are on bioidentical hormone replacement. And that was actually made, kind of put into the mainstream by Suzanne Somers in a book she called The Sexy Years. She had just started bioidentical hormone replacement when she was diagnosed with breast cancer. She is a 5-year, actually 20-some year survivor of breast cancer. Her physician did not want her on hormones, and she was not willing to live the way she felt without her hormones. So she continued on hormones while she was being treated for breast cancer. And so Suzanne Somers, I've recommended her book for so many years that if you really want to know what it feels like, because I don't, to go through menopause without hormones, and then what bioidentical hormones can do for your quality of life, read her book. It's called The Sexy Years. Came out 20-some years ago, I believe, when she was in her 50s. So the Women's Health Initiative, good morning, Linda. I'm going to give you some clinical results of a review on the Women's Health Initiative. And the Women's Health Initiative was published and actually halted, a study on hormone replacement therapy that was halted early because of a rise in breast cancer and heart attacks. So I spent a lot of time talking about the fact that heart attack and heart disease and death from heart attack is an inflammatory condition. It really doesn't have a whole lot to do with cholesterol, depending on what your ratios are, and we talked about that last week for 3 days. Ratios that you can find from, well, for 2 days, that you can find from your own lipid panel. And so what I taught back in 1990 and the 5 years that I was on the faculty to the medical students was that estradiol, specifically estradiol, was cardioprotective. And there was a lot of controversy back in the 70s, I believe it was, when women were taking Premarin, and Premarin is not estradiol, so that's an important caveat. So they were taking unopposed Premarin, and only 15% of women that were menopausal took Premarin. And at one time, it was the single most prescribed medication in the world. So Premarin unopposed does raise your risk of endometrial cancer. So the addition of Provera, which is not progesterone, and we'll talk about the chemistry of that along the way. Good morning, Wendy. We'll talk about the chemistry of that along the way. But if the addition of Provera virtually eliminated the risk of endometrial carcinoma, so uterine cancer. Uterine cancer, if you catch it early, so you have to pay attention to the red flags of cancer. And for endometrial cancer, it's postmenopausal bleeding or spotting. So you investigate that. Endometrial cancer stage 1 is 100% curable with hysterectomy. You don't even need a big, huge lymph node sampling, etc. If you find an early endometrial cancer, it can be cured with a vaginal hysterectomy. Some would say abdominal hysterectomy. I disagree. But what I taught the medical students in the early 90s was women who are not on hormone replacement therapy in their 50s, so the average age of menopause hasn't changed. It's 51.4 years in the United States. And there are women that go through earlier menopause or they're perimenopausal, so they have menopausal symptoms even though biochemically they're not menopausal. But women that are not on hormone replacement therapy actually surpass men in heart attack and heart attack death rates by the age of 65. So we know from the HERS study, I think in the United Kingdom, that estrogen is cardioprotective. It protects your heart. So much so that men were asking, can we take estrogens, estradiol specifically, so that we could protect our hearts? And of course, men can take estradiol. Transsexual females do it all the time. So they will grow breast tissue. It's actually fairly easy to do, so men taking estradiol have to put up with the fact that they might actually grow breast tissue. But it's that cardioprotective, so by the age of 65, a woman without hormone replacement therapy, for me bioidentical, has a higher rate of heart attack and death than a man at 65. Okay, well, if you add the Provera to Premarin, and we're going to get into the fact that I've never been a proponent of Premarin, PremPro, PremPhase, Provera, any of that, because they're not human, they're not bioidentical. Your body doesn't know what they are. So if you add the Provera to Premarin, then you virtually eliminate the heart disease protection risk. So my little question to medical students was, okay, so if you have something, and endometrial cancer is 100%, like I said, if you catch it and you pay attention, it's 100% curable, just with simple surgery. I guess hysterectomy technically isn't a simple surgery. So why would you eliminate the cardioprotective effect, which is the #1 killer of women in the United States, going way back in probably the history of the world, but certainly true in 1990. Why would you remove the heart attack protection and heart attack death protection that estrogen gave you to eliminate the chance of a 100% curable cancer? So that's an interesting dilemma. I'm sure that conversation has very rarely been discussed between physicians and their female perimenopausal and menopausal patients, but that's just the facts. So cancer, the big C word, scares everybody. Heart attack and heart attack death should scare you more, right? Okay, so the Women's Health Initiative was published, was halted, and that halt was published on the front page of the USA Today in 2001. I remember when it came out. And I was in Vermont, staying on the top of a mountain, and I drove down the mountain to get a newspaper, and there blasted across the front page of the USA Today was the statement, Premarin and PremPro, that's who they studied, increase the risk of breast cancer and increase the risk of heart attacks, so they halted it. So for me, so that was 11 years after I started teaching this, I said, well, duh, um, we've known Premarin um, can raise breast cancer rates, and we know that PremPro can raise breast cancer rates. The big fight is, do the others? And here was the flaw of the study. The flaw of the study was they only studied Premarin and PremPro. So Premarin, I'm sorry for coughing, but I took my meds. Premarin is named for the fact that it comes from pregnant mare urine. So if you look, that's how they make it. So if you look on a Premarin box, it doesn't say Premarin, so let's say a generic, it says conjugated equine estrogens. Okay, so there's a variety of estrogens in there, so each lot number is going to be different. Depends on the mare. So conjugated equine estrogens. Well, I I know the guy that did. I don't personally know him, but I know of the guy that was involved in developing Premarin in the 1960s. And why anybody thought that giving horse estrogen to human beings, human females, made any sense, I don't know. But that's what they did. Okay, so Premarin and PremPro were the only two things studied. That's the first flaw. Second flaw is that they started, so the average age of a woman starting on Premarin or PremPro in that study was 63 years of age. Okay, well, I just told you that the risk of heart disease, heart attack, and heart attack death is higher than a man's by the age of 65. So there is some evidence that there's some thickening of blood and potential clotting from estrogen. They're going to say estrogen, but specifically it's Premarin. And it turns out Progera is actually worse than Premarin. So sure enough, you're going to have a higher risk of heart attacks, right? You have women that for 13 years were menopausal-ish, we'll say 13-ish years, while they were headed for a higher risk of heart disease, heart attack, and cardiac death because they weren't on hormones. Everybody knew that from the HERS study. So that was flaw number 2. They only studied Premarin and PremPro. They studied nothing else. Estradiol, estrase, there's brand names, no bioidentical hormones, none of the others. I think Ogen's sort of synthetic Premarin-ish. But any of the other estrogens, Estratest, which was estradiol and testosterone, that's off the market. Okay, and then the third part was they ignored placebos. Okay, so if there was a placebo effect, they ignored that. Well, that's not fair. So you're only studying 2 of, let's say, 28 estrogens that are on the market. And estrogen, there's 3 types. Okay, so usually when somebody says, well, I don't want to take estrogen, I go, which one do you not want to take? So there's estradiol, which is made in the ovaries. It's called 17-beta estradiol. There's the biochemistry. So if estradiol is a problem, the highest breast cancer and heart attack rate should be women that are 24 pumping out huge amounts of estradiol. The second was estrone, which is made in peripheral body fat. So a lot of women that are heavier in menopause make enough estrone that they don't get hot flashes. And the other thing is people focus just on hot flashes. So the questionnaire that I had when I was in practice was 25 questions about the health effects of menopause or estrogen and progesterone and testosterone deficiency on a woman's health. Okay, and then the third estrogen is estriol. It's made in the placenta during pregnancy. It surges and has its highest rate about 20 weeks of pregnancy. I always call it the estrogen that causes the glow of pregnancy, because if you ask women that are pregnant, when did you feel best during your pregnancy, the answer is usually around 20 weeks. Okay, so that's before all the lower extremity edema and the imbalance and the weight gain and the developing fetus and the out bulging of the uterus and all that. So women at 20 weeks most of the time feel pretty good. They've gotten past nausea if they had that most of the time. So estriol is the third one. Well, you can't um, you can't put a number on estriol and actually get blocking the name. If you so pharmaceutical companies look for things that they can only they can sell. So estriol is a natural substance. You can get it from red leaf clover, etc., all that. So you can get it from compounding pharmacists, but it has to be compounded into a bioidentical hormone replacement part of your estrogen. So my thinking is estrone is probably the big cancer-y thing, heart disease thing to worry about as far as estrogens. Because estradiol is the estrogen, and estradiol and estriol are the estrogens of reproductive age in younger women. Estrone is the estrogen of menopausal and postmenopausal women that are a little heavy. Okay, so there's the thing. Women's Health Initiative was poorly designed. I mean, starting women at 63 years of age on Premarin doesn't make any sense. If you're going to start it, you start it around 50, and perimenopause under 45. I have written, I think, one Premarin prescription ever. I've used Provera not in hormone replacement but for abnormal uterine bleeding, because Provera actually acts like doing a DNC without going to the operating room. Most people use it wrong. You have to basically decrease the lining of the uterus to get rid of the bleeding, and it takes a fairly substantial dose, and there's some side effects involved, and you have to do it for 4 to 6 weeks to do it, to get rid of the abnormal bleeding, or to help with that. So Provera, so first of all, Premarin is not human estrogen, it's equine estrogen. Okay, and I told you it was the number one prescribed medication on the face of the planet. Probably right around the time they started that Women's Health Initiative. And then they figured out with Provera they can combine Premarin and Provera, and they called it PremPro. Then they had another one called PremPhase, where the progestin dose changed. But it's important to note that progesterone is a bioidentical hormone. They couldn't figure out how to give it orally. So when I was doing progesterone supplementation of early pregnancy in the luteal phase of trying to infertility cycles, we would use progesterone in vaginal suppositories. And I had a pharmacist in Omaha named Mike who figured out how to inject progesterone into gummy bears, so women could pick the flavor of gummy bear that they wanted to deliver their progesterone. And we did a study on that and showed that we got a raise in progesterone levels. I was trying to get to 25 on progesterone levels, and using vaginal suppositories, we knew that worked. And when we decided to do the gummy bear, we did a little clinical study, and we did get progesterone levels over 25 using gummy bears. So basically, Provera is a chemically altered progesterone molecule. So all of the progesterone in the world comes from the Mexican wild yam. So there are companies that sell Mexican wild yam as a progesterone supplement. That doesn't work because it takes an enzyme called diosgenin to convert the Mexican wild yam stuff into progesterone, and human beings don't have that enzyme, so it has to be done outside the body. But all the progesterone, even the Proveras, come from the Mexican wild yam. Provera, the generic name is medroxyprogesterone acetate. So there's progesterone in the middle of that, but it's been chemically altered by medroxy and acetate molecules. Way stronger than progesterone. Way more side effects than progesterone. Progesterone, as far as a side effect, it helps you sleep. It raises your body temperature, so in the winter it keeps you warmer. Okay? So here, and then we're going to go through, hopefully Wednesday and Friday, or depending, we're coming at the end of the semester. So lots of stuff and finals going on at the college and the high school. But my plan is to review the Women's Health Initiative and its effect on the clinical health and specifically the cardiac health of women now 20 years later. So it's not quite 20 years, it'll be 2021. but that study was halted in 2001. Okay, so I'm going to give you just some basic information from a talk that's actually up on Medscape. Problem is you can't link to that unless you're a member of Medscape. Okay, so this is from a talk on the clinical, oops, I just goofed it up, on the clinical impact of the Women's Health Initiative. Okay, and so a study on estrogen and progestin. So estrogen, it doesn't say estradiol because it was Premarin, equine estrogens. Okay, so what they found here, and looking at it again, and then we'll talk about the clinical impact going forward. There's a low absolute excess risk of harm for individual women. Okay, and this is just Premarin. If you take Premarin head to head with PremPro, Premarin still has health benefits that PremPro does not. So the biggest problem really is Provera. So if you're taking Provera, that's a problem in your hormone replacement. If you're taking Premarin, you got better options, way better options. And bioidenticals, I started doing bioidentical hormone replacement in 1992, and I've never had any of these issues, not one of them. Okay, so number two, for 10,000 women, so if you treat 10,000 women for 1 year, you have to randomize them to Premarin and PremPro. There were 7 more coronary heart disease events per 10,000 after a year. And most of those were in the PremPro group. So the real problem was PremPro. So if you just look at Premarin, Premarin didn't really do that. PremPro did. Number 2, 8 more strokes per 10,000 women treated for 1 year in the PremPro group. 3, 8 more pulmonary emboli and 18 more deep venous thromboses per 10,000 women treated for 1 year. So these are not the placebo women, because remember they ignored the placebo group. 8 more invasive breast cancers, 6 fewer colorectal cancers, and 5 fewer hip fractures. So we know that even though colorectal cancer is an estrogen-dependent cancer, there were fewer colorectal cancers in the Premarin and Provera group and 5 fewer hip fractures, and we know that estradiol specifically, is important in bone growth and maintenance. Okay, so you want osteoblastic activity, which lays down new bone. That is stimulated by estradiol and vitamin D and calcium. You want fewer osteoclasts, which breaks down bone, and that's where you get bone loss, osteopenia, and osteoporosis. Okay, number 4, actually, that was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I think we're at 6. Breast cancer, coronary heart disease, stroke, and pulmonary embolism made approximately equal contributions from the PremPro group. Okay, so they stopped that study because they felt the population risk was substantial, and they didn't feel it was consistent with requirements for primary prevention to preserve health and prevent disease. Okay, so then I got thinking, okay, so I used to always teach, all right, so what's the denominator? So you're talking about 7 more breast cancers, and I think they reported it was that there was a doubling. So there was 2 times as many breast cancers in the Women's Health Initiative group for those that were treated. And my question was, okay, so what's the denominator? So it would be different if I said, okay, I have 10,000 people, 2,000, so let's say 1,500, so out of 10,000 women treated for a year, 1,500 of them got breast cancer, and the regular rate was 750. That would be kind of spooky, right? But the denominator was based on 100,000. So they were talking about 10,000 treated women, but when they calculated that doubling of risk and higher risk of heart attack and all that, the denominator was per 100,000. So what you're saying is 7 out of 100,000 women not on Premarin and PremPro got breast cancer or had a risk of breast cancer, and then 7 more, or 14 per 100,000, got breast cancer if they were on Premarin or PremPro. So just like Mark Twain says, one of my favorite quotes, there's lies, damn lies, and statistics. So you can statistically almost prove anything that comes out of your mouth. Okay, so then I got looking at the breast cancer. So this is from 2019, American Cancer Society. How many cases and deaths are expected to occur in 2019? So in 2019 there was expected, and they don't give the denominator. It's like 268,600 new cases of invasive breast cancer in the United States. And I don't know all the breakdown, epidemiology of age and all that per, we have, however many women we have in this country. So, but they did do it based on age. And so age from less than 40, there estimated 11,870 cancers, breast cancers. This is invasive breast cancers. The highest risk age group was women from 60 to 69. So this is 2019. 74,820 new cases of breast cancer in women from age 60 to 64. Okay? And what was the average age of women starting on Premarin or PremPro in the Women's Health Initiative? 63. Highest risk age group for invasive breast cancer. And then the other thing that popped in my head while I was looking at this was the first statin, or I think it was Lipitor, came on the market in 1996. So I told you that was the most successful and profitable drug ever put on the market. I'm not sure, I'll look before next class, if Lipitor wound up being the #1 prescribed medication in the world. But in 1996, I believe it was still Premarin. And then 5 years later, they come out and say, oh, Premarin does this, raises heart attack risk and all that, and Lipitor took off. So was there an agenda there? Not pointing fingers, but it's an interesting timetable. So what I'll do is leave you with that little, 20 minutes, 25, we're at 27 minutes. And then we're going to discuss the Women's Health Initiative once I go through this talk and all the research, and we'll talk about the clinical implications of the Women's Health Initiative, because as soon as that came out, front page of the USA Today, women stopped taking hormone replacement therapy by the millions. And so the question is, what's the heart attack and heart attack death rate in women since 2001 in women that are menopausal? Okay, so that's the lead-in, and we should be able to do this Wednesday and Friday, or at least the next 2 classes. So y'all have a great day. I'm going to go watch them put trees in the ground, and I'll talk to you. Depends, might be tomorrow morning, might be Wednesday morning. So have a good day. It's nice and cool here, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.